So I'm going to talk today about this book, Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment by Henri Lefebvre. This book was published for the first time in any language in 2014, and I have edited this book and vetted the French translation. The discovery of this manuscript is a story in itself. In September 2008, I have arrived to the Spanish city of Zaragoza to interview Mario Gaviria, and the renowned Spanish sociologist, planner, and ecological activist. In the early 1960s, Gaviria was a student of Henri Lefebvre in Strasbourg, and he became a friend and a close collaborator of Lefebvre at the time when his theory of production of space was formulated. Belonging to Lefebvre's inner circle, Gaviria would visit him many times in Lefebvre's maternal house in Navarrenx, and they would take trips together to the Pyrenees and further down to the south of Spain. During my conversation in Zaragoza with Mario Gaviria, he recalled their collaborations, and in particular he recalled the 1973 study on tourism new towns in Spain. In particular, the study was supposed to focus on the city of Benidorm on the Mediterranean coast. Gaviria told me that he commissioned Lefebvre to write a book with the title Toward an Architecture of Pleasure. What Lefebvre delivered, however, was not meeting the expectations of Gaviria, who decided not to include the book into the results of the study. And he told me that he should still have the manuscript. And we decided to look for it in Gaviria's family house. So the next day we drove to the village of Cortes, where the family house was built in the 17th century of Gaviria's family. And there, after some good hours of searching, he has pulled out the manuscript of Vers une architecture de la jouissance. That's the French title of the book, Towards an Architecture of Enjoyment, a typescript with Lefebvre's handwritten corrections. Now, the publication of this book by the University of Minnesota Press was part of my broader study of Lefebvre, and I did the study in two perspectives. First, in my own book, Henri Lefebvre on Space, Architecture, Urban Research, and the Production of Theory from 2011, I have shown this theory as part of the shift in architectural culture around 1968 in France and beyond France. This shift was characterized by an emergence of architectural research, and it redefined the disciplinary identity of architecture, its social obligations, its political ambitions and strategies. And Lefebvre was at the center of this process. Second, I strongly believe in the productivity of Lefebvre's concepts in urban and architectural research today. And we have demonstrated this productivity in the third book, which you see here, which is called Urban Revolution Now. It is a book with case studies of applying Lefebvre's concept to a variety of cities today in Europe, in America, and in Asia. It includes, for example, a case study of Hong Kong. So as you see, there are three books which came out from my research, and so for me it's a really good time to reflect about all of that and what it means. Now, the one question which I was afraid to get after I submit my Henri Lefebvre on Space to the review was something like that. If you claim that architecture was important for Lefebvre, why among those very many books which he has written, there is no book about architecture? Now, the publication of Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment disarms those questions. Also, it seems, because a look at the table of contents of the manuscript shows that only one chapter, chapter 10, of the book is devoted to architecture. Architecture appears on this table of content among many disciplines, including philosophy, anthropology, history, psychology, semantics, economy, and so on. This means that architecture, understood as a disciplinary practice or as a collection of monuments, or a traditional way of understanding of architecture, is only marginally present in this book. By contrast, what I want to argue, and this will be the focus of my talk today, is that this book aims precisely at reconceptualization of architecture and at rethinking architecture as a mode of imagination. Lefebvre's thinking about architecture was formulated from within his multiple engagements into architectural culture in the 1960s and 1970s in France and elsewhere, and this included his comments on the discourse of state design institutes in France, his studying of everyday practices of inhabitants in buildings such as here, designed by Le Corbusier in Pessac and in Marseille. His research projects focus on housing typology such as these in the Parisian agglomeration. Lefebvre also commented on those two very highly visible projects in architecture culture in Europe at the time. Here you see New Babylon by Constant Nievenhuis on the right, and the project of a city in space by Ricardo Bofill on the left. He contributed, Lefebvre, that is, to the reform of architecture education in France, and he participated in juries of architectural competition. And if you are interested in architecture, you probably recognize people like Philip Johnson or Louis Carr with Lefebvre debating specific architectural proposals. Finally, he gave numerous interviews and in mass media, and many of them specifically were dealing with architecture. So, learning from these exchanges, Lefebvre took issue with architecture as a specialized disciplinary practice. And so, in Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment, it was rather the everyday of the inhabitant that became the starting point for Lefebvre to rethink the possibilities of architecture and to reimagine its sites, its imaginations, its operations, and its stakes. And so, in what follows, I will read Lefebvre's book as a project of architectural imagination. And this architectural imagination is, according to Lefebvre, negative, political, and materialist. Negative in the sense that it is contradicting the fundamental premises of post-war everyday life, in particular for Lefebvre, the strict division between work and non-work. Political, because it is the everyday which is the stake of every political struggle, as Lefebvre's involvements into political debates in France around '68 will show. And finally, architectural imagination is materialist, in the sense that its starting point is the materiality of the body and its rhythms. And so in this talk, I'm going to address those 3 points, and I will contextualize them in the work of Lefebvre in the French debates in the wake of May '68, and I will also move beyond these points in order to argue that this work is useful today. In order to do that, I will begin with discussing the spaces of leisure as a privileged sites for exploring these possibilities. So, as I have already mentioned, spaces of leisure in Spain were the original topic of Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment. For Lefebvre, spaces of leisure and spaces of mass tourism exemplify the process of reproduction of capitalism through the production of space. They result from the second circle of capital and real estate investment, and they are site of the reproduction of labor power. Yet at the same time, Lefebvre argued that in these spaces, quote, the body regains a certain right to use. And I'm illustrating him this with the image of the philosopher himself, with his wife and the baby daughter in Spain. So he was, if you like, he was practicing those spaces of leisure he was describing. So in other words, for Lefebvre, spaces of leisure were an indispensable part of the post-war space production, and at the same time they reveal its breaking points. In particular, Lefebvre contrasted spaces of leisure with large post-war housing estates in France and elsewhere, including housing estates such as these in Spain and Madrid, which were analyzed by Mario Gaviria. Lefebvre argued that these ensembles were not only oppressive, but they were also anachronistic, since they did not account for the society in which urban space was about to replace the factory as a space of socialization, struggle, and increasingly as a space of production. In other words, a society which was moving beyond Fordism. In this context, tourist new towns appeared as strategic approximations of the other of post-war housing estates. And Mario Gaviria argued that it was in the tourist new towns that architectural and urban innovations are possible at that time. And in Benidorm, the city which was the main focus of the study, this included both architectural projects and a new image or a new sense of urbanity, in the sense of a compact urbanity. And this argument that the future of the society will be defined by leisure was widely discussed in 1960s France, in particular by people like Geoffroy Dumas-Didier and his influential hypothesis about the civilization of leisure. At that time, spaces of leisure became privileged sites for architectural experimentation, with those holiday villages which experimented with new types of housing typologies, but also in this rather ironic vision of a redevelopment of a Parisian housing estate. And so for Lefebvre, spaces of leisure revealed the contradictions of post-war space and the possibility of its alternatives. They were sites where, quote, the existing mode of production produces both its worst and its best. Spaces of leisure were neither exceptional enclaves in the dominant mode of production of space, nor reflections of the simple reflections of the interests of the dominant class. Rather, and this is the main point of the study, they exacerbate the contradictions of the social totality, revealing the antagonistic forces operating within it. In other words, for Lefebvre, spaces of leisure were sites which condense the most extraordinary promises of modernity with the dangers of ultimate alienation. So, if for Marx the past repeats itself as a farce, for Lefebvre the future is announced in a grotesque. In Tourist New Towns, the experience of the body beyond the division of labor is intermingled with its commodified images and fragmented gestures. The potential of the body appears in ridiculous, distorted, awkward forms as vacation festivals which caricaturize the appropriation of space, he wrote. In that sense, the experience of the spaces of leisure is not an instance of fetishism, but rather a hunch of emancipation in the sense of overturning a social order which assigns specific groups to specific sites and specific times. Now, spaces of leisure come with that premonition for Lefebvre of an everyday defined by non-work rather than production, by excess rather than accumulation, by gift rather than exchange. This is a utopia, but Lefebvre writes that it is a concrete utopia, a utopia which is negative, that is to say, which contradicts the premises of the current social order. More specifically, concrete utopia imagines the everyday beyond the division of labor, beyond an economy of exchange, and beyond the state as the primary agents of economic management and cultural subjectivity. Lefebvre argues that this negation is an architectural operation. He writes, quote, "Concrete utopia aims at a concept of a new space which can be only based on an architectural project." And this negative concrete utopia is contrasted by Lefebvre with a positive abstract utopia. An abstract utopia is positive in that sense that it is an extrapolation of the current condition towards the future. And for Lefebvre, post-war urban planning in France with projects such as these were an example of that abstract utopia. And here you can see an issue of Paris Match from 1967, which presents the vision of Paris in 20 years. So that opposition between architecture as a producer of concrete utopia and urban planning, or urbanisme in French, as a producer of abstract utopia, are the two ways which Lefebvre uses in order to distinguish between the possibilities of production of space in the book, in Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment. Lefebvre urged to uncover the place of architecture which has been forgotten and erased. According to him, architecture in post-war France becomes an intermediate of urban planning as a projection of the social order on the territory. And this argument was developed by one of his first case studies, which was focused on this town of Mourenx in southwestern France. And there he has seen architecture as a transmitter of the division of labor in the factories and the respective social hierarchies. The management personnel would live in detached houses, the supervisors in towers, and the workers in blocks of flats. By contrast to that vision, Lefebvre argued that architectural imagination requires, quote, "suspending by means of thought the powers which subordinate architectural production." This suspension is not a project of an exception to capitalism, let alone a project of resisting capitalism by architectural means. Rather, it aims at staking out the field of investigation. The operation is epistemic, not political. But the motivations are political, and so were its consequences, since after the brackets are lifted, the products of this investigation, concepts, images, re-enter social practice as projects and counter-projects. Now, the political dimension of Lefebvre's definition of architecture becomes evident when his book, when Toward an Architecture of Enjoyment, is read in the context of the French politics, particularly on the French left of the 1970s. And in particular in the context of the so-called Common Program, or the coalition signed in 1972 between the French Communist Party and the Socialist Party. The program was expected to bring the left to power, and architects and planners were summoned to contribute to that program and to explore its possibilities for architecture and for urban design. While the coalition came to an abrupt end in 1978, it facilitated a period of experimentation among French left architects and planners. So what was specific for the Common Program was its discourse about unblocking human potential, which was supposed to be restrained in the current society. In the words of one commentator, a socialism of abundance and socialism of human self-realization, rather than a socialism of accumulation according to the Soviet model. And these ideas were discussed by architects and planners in a variety of venues, including the colloquium Foreign Urbanism, which took place in the city of Grenoble in 1974. In that colloquium, Lefebvre's distinction between architecture and urbanism can be read as an intervention into some of the most relevant discussions on the French left, and in particular, discussions during this meeting. These discussions focused on the production of space in communist-controlled municipalities in France. Were they enclaves in advance of the current mode of production? Ask some of the participants. Where millions of people live day every day in rupture with the dominant ideology? Or rather, as others argued, were the last instances of municipal communism increasingly obsolete in the view of the limitations imposed on urban design and financing of housing by the central French government? And these experiences reflected the practice of communist-governed municipalities in France, such as this one in Ivry. The renovation of this traditionally communist municipality in the agglomeration of Paris was presented during the colloquium and discussed by Lefebvre as an attempt to grant the working class the right to live and to work in the city. And this renovation of the urban fabric in Ivry, including housing, as well as public spaces, shops, and offices. It was based on the collaboration between the architect René Gay-Hostet and her colleague Jean Renaudy, the municipality and inhabitants. So the whole project was kind of redefined, the organization of architectural labor. And that different type of organization of architectural labor was to be generalized after the means promised by the Common Program were made available. The architect Jean Renaudy explained that the formal principles of the project, with the overlapping of dwellings and the visual contacts between the inhabitants, were supposed to encourage social interaction and facilitate collective activities. Writing in 1984 and commenting on this project, Lefebvre argued that architecture in Ivry aimed at preventing the isolation of an architectural object. Rather, architecture here allowed imagining habitation as an articulation of several levels, from the apartment to the urban territory. And this is how Lefebvre interpreted his concept of the right to the city beyond the 1960s struggle over the French welfare state and towards the right to habitation and the right to urban life. And this critique of an isolated architectural object was tuned into much of architectural experimentation after May 68 in France. And this experimentation included projects such as these, experiments with inflatable structures by the Utopie group, a group of young architects. More radical were attempts at dissolving architecture in the momentary enjoyment in an ephemeral situation, in a flux of social energy, as it was postulated by the Centre d'études de recherche and the Formation institutionnelle, or CERFI, an institution which, in the wake of 1968, proposed fundamental redefinition and redesigning of such institutions as mental clinics and schools. Other remarkable examples of that, changes in architectural culture included this movie Esquizo, directed by Ricardo Bofill, the architect, at the time at his most intense exchanges with Lefebvre, and the movie elaborated, an experimental movie that elaborated on the production of space by the body. And so these experiments shared with Lefebvre the understanding that architecture needs to be conceptualized as part of the rhythmic continuum of space, and a rhythmic space production which starts with the body. Lefebvre urged to analyze this continuum of rhythms everywhere where there is interaction between a place and time and an expenditure of energy. There is rhythm. Since the 1960s, he was working on the projects of rhythm analysis, which would allow to theorize the production of space as an interference of rhythms, whether cyclical or linear, repetitive or differentiated, singular or aggregative. The rhythm analyst thinks the body not in abstract, but in lived temporality, wrote Lefebvre. And this is how he analyzed the origins of May 68 at the campus of the University of Paris, Nanterre, located at the outskirts of Paris, next to Chantetown. And
The site was famously presented in this long shot by Jean-Luc Godard's La Chinoise. So you could see all the site of the university where Lefebvre was a professor. And you can see him here among his students, and he was from within that moment, he was commenting and theorizing on the campus and its role in Paris. In a rhythm analytical perspective, the revolt in Nanterre, where the events of May 68 started, targeted separations maintained by the spatial layout of the campus, which transformed those separations into lived contradictions. The contradiction between work, housing, and leisure, between private and public spaces, between male and female students. In May 68, in Nanterre, these contradictions erupted. And this was by commenting on these events, by thinking about Nanterre, that Lefebvre for the first time introduced this term enjoyment or jouissance into his theorizing of space production. Rather than being a technical concept clearly defined and consistently used throughout the text, jouissance was employed by Lefebvre in order to lay out a broad field of investigation. Jouissance or enjoyment stands in Lefebvre's text for transgression, for expenditure, for excess. In Towards an Architecture of Enjoyment, he revisited a number of possible candidates for such architecture of space, of jouissance. And let me finish by discussing one of them, namely this rather famous project, the project of the phalanstery, in the writing of Charles Fourier, the 19th century so-called utopian socialist. Fourier envisaged phalanstery, this building, as a building for 1,620 inhabitants and as a node of the future society, maybe you could say a node of the future network society. In this vision, architecture is an assemblage of senses, forms, discourses, bodies, and ideas. In Fourier's vision, the phalanstery is based on a combination of different people and their passions, which produce new relationships of love and labor. The phalanstery was modeled according to the Palais Royal in Paris, which Fourier frequented, which is the place of the theater, gallery, and encounter, place of an encounter, place of work, and place of leisure. And so I would like to show you now an excerpt from an interview in 1972, shot in 1972, where Lefebvre commented on architecture and specifically on Fourier. And you will see that this interview was shot itself in the Palais Royal. And so the interview is in French, but I have put English subtitles, and I have given the translator those subtitles so they can translate them into Chinese.
Je crois que Fourier est aussi important que Marx, bien que différemment. Et aujourd'hui, Fourier me semble aussi actuel que Marx, dans la mesure même où nous sommes à la veille soit de la plus grande catastrophe, soit du plus heureux dénouement, c'est-à-dire d'une société de la jouissance, à moins qu'elle ne sombre dans le chaos sanglant. Ce qu'il a appelé le phalanstère, c'est un perfectionnement du Palais Royal. Et ça, c'est très intéressant, très important, non seulement pour sa pensée, mais pour l'histoire de la pensée. C'est la première fois qu'on a l'idée qu'une société doit créer un lieu qui lui convienne. Et je crois que le problème se pose encore. Alors, ici, vous avez là-bas un théâtre, vous avez les galeries, vous avez le lieu de rencontre, c'est-à-dire les colonnes, où tout le monde, tous les habitants qui sont dans la pensée de Fourier, 1800 environ, peuvent se rencontrer. Puis vous avez les lieux d'échange, les lieux de travail, et puis les lieux de commerce, et puis aussi l'endroit où les plaisirs s'achèvent dans le festin qui joue un très grand rôle pour Fourier. Il se méfie de la nature. Il ne ressemble pas du tout à ce que d'autres, des architectes comme Le Corbusier, tireront sa pensée. C'est pas du tout un village, le phalanstère. L'erreur que l'on fait sur la pensée de Fourier, c'est très souvent de concevoir comme une espèce de communisme ascétique et une vie de phalanstère dans un village. Non, c'est un palais, c'est une vie de château, c'est un opéra réglé, dans un luxe, dans une richesse qui se déploie. C'est l'homme de la richesse, Fourier.
So, as you could see in this short excerpt, what Lefebvre does is to oppose asceticism, prevalent on the political left in France since the mid-19th century. By contrast, he reads Fourier as a thinker of luxury. On the conceptual map of Lefebvre, luxury is not conspicuous consumption, but rather it is collective luxury. This concept of collective luxury becomes a common denominator for Lefebvre's imaginary revisiting of collective spaces and toward an architecture of enjoyment. In his readings, social spaces resemble objects of luxury rather than consumer articles. In difference to objects of consumption, social spaces are not destroyed in the course of their use, but rather their use value is enhanced by use. So the more intense, differentiated, unpredictable the use of social spaces is, the more desirable they become. To conclude, the way Lefebvre reads Fourier's ideas about collective luxury can be seen as an example of architectural imagination and work. It subscribes to the three operations which I have described in this talk. It is first negative, in the sense that it contradicts the fundamental division of everyday life, in particular the most important of them, in Lefebvre's view, that between work and non-work. Second, it is political, in the most general sense that every political project for Lefebvre is about the changing of everyday life, but also in a more specific and contextualized sense, feeding into that discourse of socialism of abundance, as opposed to the socialism of asceticism, which I mentioned before in relationship to the common program. And finally, it starts with the body and its rhythms, and it extends towards a vision of architecture as an assemblage of sensual and intellectual pleasures. And so understood architectural imagination, argued Lefebvre, was the starting point for rethinking urbanization in general. And I think that this is an unfinished project and one which is worth working on. Thank you very much.